So I'll give you partially in response to your questions, and then we can go back to our discussion afterwards. I will give you some basics of how Marx thinks about things, and then we can critique Marx afterwards, because Karl Marx is obviously controversial. And a few places he's controversial, obviously, are in US politics today. So the idea of Karl Marx and Marxists absolutely enrages the current US administration. Also in economics, Marx is controversial because if you are taking economics classes, you will probably use different ideas of what wealth means than Karl Marx used. So Marx comes into conflict with sort of mainstream economics. And then there's the matter of how Marx's own life relates to Marx's work, and especially his theories of economy. So Marx is a controversial figure, not really a mainstream figure outside of the academic world, and yet his concepts continue to be quite useful throughout communication studies. We're thinking in Germany. Karl Marx was a German philosopher. He spent much of his life drinking. He spent a lot of time in pubs. He did not spend much time making money. So at one point in his life, his mother was tired of receiving requests for money from Karl and complained that she would have preferred that Karl make money, earn money, rather than writing about capital, if only he had made capital instead of writing about it. So he was brilliant in critiquing the way that economics worked. He wrote these big books, but he was not good at making lots of money from his books, or in general at earning enough money to feed himself and so on. If Marx did not come from a middle class, bourgeois family, he wouldn't have been able to lead the life that he led, writing the books that he wrote. As it was, though, he was a hugely prolific author. So Marx wrote a lot. He wrote constantly, huge amounts of work, including this magnum opus of Marx's, which is called Capital. So big chunk of work critiquing the way that economics work in capitalist society. Marx's Capital. Marx is known for writing a much shorter document also called the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto from 1848 lays out the purposes and a general outline of what communism is. So obviously communism wouldn't become a massive political force until much later. So the idea of a communist country being a real thing that exists in the world came far after Marx was theorizing about it. And it came in a place that Marx didn't suspect. So Marx thought that the government of Russia was too oppressive, was too successful at oppressing people to allow for a communist revolution to happen. But in reality, the government of Russia in the 1800s and early 1900s and how it oppressed the people of Russia was precisely the reason why the communist revolution happened there, because there was more appetite for revolution, more of a need that people felt to overthrow the government, otherwise they were going to starve. So eventually communist governments did appear, but it wasn't in the ways that Marx thought. And Marx is known for his huge influence throughout philosophical and theoretical thought for many years after his death, continuing today. Perhaps the most basic principle of the thinking of Marx is a division between infrastructure or base, the basics, and a superstructure. Karl Marx had a strong sense of what was most basic in society, what was most based, if we say this in contemporary sort of internet speech. And what was basic for Marx was economics, and particularly material aspects of economics. So material for Marx included things like factories and tools, trains, the ways in which we move anything from one place to another, the resources that we harvest, ships, nowadays it would include planes. The material world is the world of things that we get, that we take from to feed ourselves and to live our lives as basic creatures in the world. That's the basics, according to Marx. And then, supported by the basics is a huge apparatus of other stuff that comprises our cultures and societies and what Marx called our ideologies. So the ideas with which we describe the world are not the basics, according to Marx. Those are things that come after. Our discourses, our ways of communicating about things are built on top of the economic base. This division could be seen as somewhat arbitrary. Like, what even counts as the difference between an idea and a material? Especially nowadays in digital culture where ideas have such obvious influence and are encoded into the bits and bytes of our computers, a division between culture and society and material seems more difficult to make. But nevertheless, if we start analyzing the world with this division in mind, we can achieve certain insights. And some examples of those are the concepts that are on their way. So Marx is known for a concept of value that irritates many mainstream economists today. And this is the idea of use value. So for Marx, when you harvest an apple from a tree, you pick the apple from the tree, there you have an apple, and the apple has a use, something you can do with the apple, such as eat the apple. That's probably what you're going to do. So clearly this apple has its use value. When you have a car or a bicycle, you're using that thing to go from one place to another. That is its use value that it gives to you. Use value is different. So meaning consists in difference. A concept is only useful if we can contrast it with something else. And for Marx, the contrast that defines use value is between use value and exchange value. So you pick an apple off the tree and then you sell it to me in exchange for something else, whether that's money or maybe I trade you my lunch for yours or something like that. All of that is exchange value. And for Marx, exchange is not basic. First, you need the material use value of something, and then concepts of exchange value follow afterwards. Capitalism is a social system that enables exchange in ways that earlier social systems didn't. So the driving force, or the thing that makes capitalism possible and that makes possible the social conditions that Marx critiqued, was free exchange, a certain kind of free-flowing exchange. Labor time is the time that one takes to produce something. So when you are reaching up and you are picking the apple, you are investing a certain amount of your time to do this. Likewise, if you are reaching up to grab the apple and then you trip and break your arm, that also adds to the labor time to harvest the apple. Now you have to recover from this broken arm and so on. So every piece of work that you do in the world can be measured in a certain way in the amount of time of your life that you devote to this thing. Time is kind of the basic currency, according to Marx. So we put labor time into harvesting, into producing, and from that harvesting and producing, we get use values of things. However, surplus value also results. So as I harvest apples, I gain eventually more apples than I can eat myself. And this surplus becomes something that I start to exchange. But if I control a whole farm where other people are harvesting apples for me, I get into a situation where I can concentrate huge amounts of surplus value if I have sort of ownership over a system. And I can start to take value more than I give it back to the people who are doing the harvesting. And this is the crucial role that capital plays in capitalism. So for Marx, capital, this concept of capital, specifically has to do with profit. In order for capitalism to exist and in order for capital to exist, we have to do more than take what we need. We have to take extra. And specifically, for capitalism to happen, somebody has to take extra from large groups of other people, needs to concentrate the results of the invested labor time of other people, and then start exchanging this extra, this surplus value. Capital is the profit that is extracted from workers and is entered into these processes of exchange. So if you say that you have capital, it means that you have more than you need. Capital only exists when somebody has more than they need. And capital is always harvested from others. There's always a relationship of exploitation in capital. So capital is not just any situation where money exists, and it's not just any situation where value exists. It's specifically this exploitive surplus that some rich people gain in a capitalist society. You can see where the politics are going here, right? Marx has a particular direction of people that he wants to win in struggles, and a particular class of people that he does not like. So you can see that Marx is setting up a critique of especially people who own factories, who own large amounts of stuff, and who don't give to the people who need, and instead are taking from others. For Marx, a product is something that hides its process. So the process of harvesting something becomes forgotten in the product that results from that. And nowadays, this is super obvious in the difference between the conditions of production of something like a phone or a computer that involve vast amounts of metals that are rare enough that they require scraping up a huge amount of soil, most of that harvesting being done in China nowadays. And how when you use these devices and we experience the convenience of these devices, we're not thinking of the origins of the devices and potentially the environmental and humanitarian destruction, or the environmental and human destruction that goes into these devices. By the way, I don't have this on the slide here, but Marx had a particular conception of what a machine is, and a machine for Marx is what he called dead labor. So it is the accumulated labor time in an object where it's kind of fossilized. So for Marx, if he's looking around at the laptops and so on in the room, he would think about these things as almost like dinosaur fossils. They're the labor time of other people that become these like skeletal remains. Dead labor is a machine per Marx. And all of this accumulates tension toward a class conflict. And major class conflicts, yeah, I've just put class conflict on the slide there. And this is not too difficult of a concept to understand, but for Marx, looking around at the urban world around him, he could see that the factory owners were vastly wealthier than the people actually operating the factories. He could see that the interests of those two groups diverged, the interest of the working class operating the factories versus the interests of the capitalists, the owners, and the conflict between those two classes, according to Marx, would result in the communist revolution. So he thought the revolution was sort of inevitable. However, a nuance about Marx's theory that often gets lost is that Marx actually likes capitalism better than an earlier system. So for Marx, capitalism in the process of history comes after the earlier system of feudalism, when people were controlled by their lords and masters who, were protected in castles and just told people what to do throughout their lives. So feudalism, the older system, is worse, according to Marx, and instead capitalism with its freer flowing exchange and communication is a step up from feudalism. It's an improvement over feudalism. And after capitalism comes communism, according to Marx. So there's this three-stage development of human history, according to Marx, where communism, or at least socialism, which is close in concept to communism, are the improvement after capitalism. And through a revolution that ends capitalism, Marx thought that we would eventually get to a society where each person receives according to their need and gives according to their ability. Sounds great, but in practice, obviously extremely difficult to actually have. And from this, I'll sort of introduce some of the critiques that have been aimed at Marx. So I'll introduce a couple of them, and then we can go into some more detail once I turn off the camera. So one is this idea of use value. So how do you say where use value ends and exchange value begins? So for example, a classic example is if I have a flower shop. So I pick flowers and I sell them to people from a flower shop. And then people buy the flowers from my shop, and then they use those flowers to give to people they care about or to decorate their houses or something like that. What is the difference between the use value of the flower and the exchange value of the flower? Maybe you could say that flowers that come from this flower shop are pure exchange value. So they only exist within an economic system where each person is just using the flower to exchange for something else in some way. So if I give my friend a flower, then maybe my friend will like me more or something like that. Maybe you could take this kind of cynical understanding where there is no use value of the flowers. It's all about exchange. And therefore, when I own my flower shop and I take flowers and sell them there, I'm just harvesting from nature to create exchange value as efficiently as possible. But then clearly we actually do use the flowers in a way that appears to our senses. We will smell the pleasant smells of the flowers. We will see the pleasant appearances of the flowers. So we are using the flowers somehow in a way that is embedded in how we exchange the flowers. So yes, we exchange the flowers, we give them to our friends and so on, but we are also benefiting from the flowers in a way that's hard to distance from some sort of sense of use value. And you can find similar discussions of most, maybe any product if you really insist on a critical understanding of Marx. So the concept of use value can be kind of attacked by saying, where are actually the limits of use value? Can you really say that something has only exchange value and not use value, or only use value and not exchange value? This doesn't completely destroy Marx's theory, however, because at the same time, in your economics classes, you'll find similarly weird concepts that you can attack from a variety of angles. So for example, in mainstream economics, a central concept is the idea of marginal value. So the increased or decreased value of buying one more of a thing or getting one more of a thing. And I'm not a mainstream economist, I'm not an economist, so I won't get into too many details there, except to say that if you really want to be critical of mainstream economics, you can do it there too. You can really ask hard questions about what really is marginal value in any sort of practical sense. But there's a sort of core controversy. Another controversy about Marx has to do with his sense of history and what has actually happened when communist revolutions have happened. And unfortunately, the communist revolutions that have happened in history have not resulted in the kinds of societies that Marx wanted. So the result of the Russian Revolution was, yes, a kind of communist government, but after that came an extremely brutal dictatorship and a whole lot of violence that followed after that revolution that did not lead to this great communist society that Marx envisioned. So a debate among people who want to closely follow Marx's ideas is whether the communist revolution, such as it happened in Russia, was somehow just done wrong, so it wasn't a real communist revolution, or whether something is wrong with Marx's theory of how a revolution is supposed to happen. Likewise, in Germany, the attempt at a communist revolution was one of the precursors to the rise of fascism. And fascism, Nazism, was something that came historically far after Marx's time. So Marx did not envision fascism, didn't have this in mind as something that could happen after a revolution, and yet we know that this is another social system that can result from the collapse of a certain kind of capitalist system, or conversely, the overgrowth of a certain kind of capitalist system. So the idea that capitalism will eventually go away and be replaced by communism is not that simple. That's not what really happened in history. However, once again, you will almost never find a theorist who makes perfect or even especially good predictions about what happens in the future. You'll find across the practice of theorizing how society works, theorists usually fail in their predictions about what the future will be like. All of those predictions are extremely speculative. So Marx is not the only thinker who is vulnerable to the critique that the way that he said history was going to go is not the way that it's actually gone. Predicting the future is obviously beyond the abilities of mere humans. We can only speculate, make better and worse guesses.